Okay, so I got a ton of questions following a video that I did on defined benefit schemes, and it was really clear that there isn't that much information out there on these type of schemes. So what I did is I put a community post out there, and I also looked at all my comments and I thought, right, let's take some of the best questions from this, and I'll do this as a bit of a Q&A. So in this video, I'm going to be going over your crucial questions around defined benefit schemes and do my very best to answer them. If you don't know me, my name is George Agan. I'm a chartered financial planner. I'm a fellow of the Personal Finance Society, and I've helped thousands of people retire without worry. I've also worked specializing with defined benefit schemes for many years, so I think I've got a pretty good handle on them. So without further ado, let's dive in. So the first question is, I think many people at my age, 55, will probably have a mixture of defined benefit or defined contribution pensions. That's guaranteed pensions and flexible pensions, by the way. I'd be interested in your view on how you'd consider taking these, in particular from an early retirement perspective, e.g. take the reduced defined benefit small bridge with the defined contribution until state pension age, or bridge with the defined contribution until normal retirement age with the defined benefit scheme. I've got quite a few questions on this theme, which is just how do you use your defined benefit and your defined contribution together. So let's dive right in. The first thing we have to do to make this decision is we need to really understand the structure of the defined benefit scheme first and the impact of things like normal retirement ages, early retirement factors, and commutation factors. So just to recap, early retirement factors are basically a reduction factor and that they're applied if you take your scheme before the normal retirement age. So you first need to check your normal retirement age. It can be 60, some at 65, and some at state pension age. The reason why this matters when considering it with the defined contribution pension, the flexible pension, is you really need to understand how generous or not generous your defined benefit scheme is going to be if you take it before normal retirement age or you try and use that type of strategy. Interesting technical point here, which a lot of advisors even don't know, is that schemes can apply different ways that they apply this reduction, the early retirement factor. For example, most schemes apply the early retirement factor based on what the pension's valued of today. So let's do a really simple example. You've got £10,000 of a pension currently built up. That's the current value. You're 55 and you're going to take the benefits. Now, the normal retirement age of the scheme is 60 and they've told you they're going to apply a factor of 0.7, which is basically 70% of the benefits if you take it at 55 now instead of 60. So that means that that's basically a 30% reduction on what it was going to be because you're getting 70% of the benefits at normal retirement age of 60. Makes sense? So very simply, that £10,000 is going to be £7,000 today. Really easy, right? However, some schemes, when they apply that factor, actually revalue or make an assumption on inflation up to normal retirement age before they apply the factor. So let's go back to that example. Let's say you've got a £10,000 pension. And what the scheme actuaries do is they're going to assume inflation is 3% for the 5 years until 60. Then what happens? Now the projected future value is actually 11,592, and then they apply the 30% reduction, or that 0.7% factor. So the pension you get is not 7,000, it's now 8,114. You can see quite a big difference. That's why knowing the factors and how your scheme works is really important. And any advisor worth their salt is going to be trying to understand this and ideally get retirement illustrations from the scheme direct. That's basically what you say to the scheme, I want to retire at this age, can you provide me an illustration of what your actuaries think that's going to be? Now, they will bake in their own inflation assumptions and the factors. It can change at any point, all this stuff, so it is a best estimate, especially for the future. But ultimately, it's from the source. So while you can get the factors and calculate it yourself, there can be some variance depending on what the scheme actuaries do under the hood. So well worth checking with the scheme on that quote if you can get it. But going back to your question, because I know that was a bit of a diversion from the question, the reason I wanted to explain that is that the devil is in the detail here about how you're going to use your defined benefit scheme. So the things I would need to know from a client to kind of make that assessment is when they're retiring, how much of a gap is it? Does the scheme have anything else we need to be aware of? So some offer what's called a bridging pension, where they uplift the pension for a certain point and drop it down when you hit state pension age. The early retirement factors are going to be massive. The inflation assumptions are going to be big. I also need to understand not just the defined benefit scheme, but also the defined contribution scheme and any other assets, if they've got any cash or anything. And then we need to have a look at the calculations versus taking it now versus another date. And that might also be not just 60, but also any other options we might look at. And I would consider what's called crossover analysis or timing analysis, cumulative value analysis. I kind of mentioned that in the previous video to work that out. One strategy that I've actually been discussing with a client recently is you'll know if you've watched a few of my videos that in retirement, sequence of return risk for investments is massive, as in you don't know what market conditions you're going to retire into, and the order of returns you get can have a massive impact. So if you do have a sizable defined benefit scheme which you could pull or draw when the time is right, you could be quite tactical here and you go, actually, I might use my defined benefit scheme as a way to mitigate or reduce sequence risk. Now, all of this is highly individual and subject to the scheme information and the factors and all the rest of it. But how that strategy could work is, okay, you go, I've got a defined benefit scheme. I could take it now, but if the markets are kind, I'm going to live off my investments. But if we do see a market drop, yes, I will have early retirement factors applied, but then that will allow me to stop withdrawals from my flexible pension. To the same extent, if the market is kind for like 5 years, you can go, well, while I didn't take the pension earlier, I have ultimately, I've got myself higher guaranteed income now. And let's be honest, the markets are eventually going to have a wobble. So it's good risk management. But I got to mention this is complicated. It depends on a myriad of very personal factors. And bear in mind, if you are going to consider this, make sure you've got at least 6 months of runway in liquid assets to support that, because schemes, from my experience, I think it's a fair thing to say, can take a very long time to give you quotes and pay benefits. So just make sure you're not expecting it all to happen tomorrow. Okay, next question. This is a really good one. A viewer basically asked me, are defined benefit schemes as good as they're made out to be? So, Midnight Archive 25 said, I'm in a scheme that offers 1/75 of my salary as an annual pension income, plus a lump sum of 3 times that amount. I contribute 6% of my salary while my employer contributes 19%. Assuming I earn £35,000 a year and I stay in the scheme for 30 years, I'd receive an annual pension of around £14,000 and a lump sum of £42,000 in retirement. Yep, that all sounds about right. However, if I invested the same contributions in the stock market and I received a conservative real return of 4%, then the pension pot could be worth £500,000. And I could just use £400,000 to buy an annuity, which based on June rates at 6.94% for a 65-year-old, might pay £27,000 per year, clearly much higher than the £14,000 from the scheme. Okay, this is an amazing question, and it really allows me to dive deep into, I think, some of the misconceptions around defined benefit schemes, or certainly some things that are worth mentioning. The first thing that I think it's really important to remember now is that a defined benefit scheme is basically a pension promise from your employer or your ex-employer for life. They take all the risk of fulfilling that guaranteed income. So stock market returns are broadly irrelevant to your pension outcome. Now, that's not technically true because their solvency does depend on your pension outcome. But even if your employer or your ex-employer were to go bust, there is a lifeboat scheme called the Pension Protection Fund, or it's abbreviated often to PPF, which is also why this channel can never use abbreviations. Anyway, that can have an impact on your benefits. It can reduce inflation increases or even cut the benefits. So compared to an investment, they are very, very secure. And that security is worth considering because we are currently in, certainly compared to the last sort of 10, 15 years, in a higher interest rate environment than we were. Now, that is making that comparison look not quite as good as it did, say, for example, in the midst of 2020 or in COVID when interest rates are at the floor. But that doesn't mean that this annuity rate environment will continue or be anything like that when you come to retire. So that uncertainty, which you would only get certainty on the annuity rate when you were to purchase said annuity, is going to be really key. Thing just to mention, and this is generally very confusing, is that employee and employer contributions, certainly in relation to annual allowance or your benefit value, are a bit of a red herring. Your contributions to your own pension actually aren't how you calculate annual allowance at all for your defined benefit scheme. And they don't really have much to do with how much your pension's worth because that's related to your salary. But I'll just park that for now. But let's go back to those annuity rates because that was key to your assumption. And I've discussed that if annuity rates go down again, that has no bearing on your defined benefit scheme because your employer or ex-employer are still going to take on all the risk of fulfilling that pension. But the figures that you've given me in relation to that annuity scheme, they're probably not a fair like-for-like comparison to a defined benefit scheme. And other advisors, we do kind of get this quite a lot because when people go to annuity comparison sites, there's a real commercial incentive to be frank, for them to get the phone call or the inquiry in relation to the annuities. So they often give the absolute best headline rate possible as far as annuity rates. So a lot of times those annuities they give you, maybe the 6.94% or whatever, they're single life, so they're based just on your life. A lot of times there's no inflation protection. Bear in mind that over a 30-year retirement time frame, inflation, as we've seen and will continue to see, will half, if not maybe a third, the real value of your pension over that period. Very simply, you know, the pound of pension you get at 60 might only give you, I don't know, between 30 and 50p when you're 90. However, a defined benefit scheme has those inflation protections. And also, typically, and you know, typically is doing some heavy lifting here, defined benefit schemes will have a spousal pension built in. Sometimes, and that basically is a spouse or civil partner pension that when you pass away, there's going to be a pension that will carry on. Commonly it's 50%, sometimes it can be as good as 2/3. So let's do a like for like calculation, because I think that's going to be much fairer and it is going to change the maths of this entirely. So let's run it. I did an annuity quote based on a 65-year-old male as of today, so you're 65, and I took that £400,000 figure. But this time I used an annuity rate called LPI, which is basically inflation to the maximum 5%. And this mirrors a lot of defined benefit schemes, not all of them, but a lot of them. You know, basically some inflation protection. I also then put a 50% spouse's pension. So if you pass away, the spouse's pension pays at 50%, and a 5-year guarantee. This is kind of, I think, if I was to make a single assumption, the best proxy I can give you, annuity rate comparisons to defined benefit schemes. And through that, because of that inflation protection and all those other features, I actually get a 3.78% rate instead of the 6.94% you gave me. So immediately that's completely shifted the maths without even thinking about the annuity rate risk over that period. A thing that I don't know based on the information I was given is I don't know whether this is going to be a career average revalued earnings. My instinct from some of the employer contributions is this is a government scheme of some sort, NHS or otherwise. But how it works basically is career average schemes give you kind of a slice of earnings that you accrue as a pension as you go. But a final salary scheme, as the name suggests, it links to your final salary. So going back to that example you gave me, which again, this is important, you may be on 35,000 now, but if it's a final salary and you end up earning 100,000 over 30 years, that pension you leave with is going to be massively different because it's not going to be based on your today £35,000 salary. It's going to be based on your £100,000 salary when you leave. Now, I know that's far from guaranteed you're going to leave with that salary, but I'm using it to illustrate the point more than anything. Okay, next question. Are AVCs, are they worth doing? How is my AVC money investing? Are the returns guaranteed? Oh, there's a lot of questions there. What are the benefits and drawbacks of paying AVCs over an ordinary SIP? Okay, so the question of how your AVC's money is invested, that's the easiest one. Check with your scheme. Normally, you can switch investment options with your AVCs, and if you're asking that question, the first thing to do is check with your pension provider, because you need to have a look at, is this in a fund which is right for my goals, whatever that may be? Are you going to be getting the growth you hope for? The fact you're asking that question is a prompt for action, I would say. Definitely check. Now, the question of are the returns guaranteed? The reason why I'm pausing with this is because there's kind of devil in the detail depending on what scheme, and I'm having to give an answer that is going to be right for most people. Generally speaking, AVCs will sit alongside a defined benefit scheme, and the key advantage for AVCs, and this is one where if any of you out there have AVCs, which are additional voluntary contributions, you check is, can you use that additional voluntary contribution pot to effectively take more tax-free cash later? That's the big benefit from additional voluntary contributions. So basically how this works is that when you take your defined benefit scheme, for most, you'll be given two options. You'll be given full pension and then a smaller pension plus a tax-free cash lump sum. Now, the tax-free cash lump sum, by the way, does not equate to 25% or anything. It's a different calculation with defined benefit schemes. Now, what additional voluntary contributions or AVCs allow you to do is they allow you in some circumstances, if the scheme rules permit, to basically, instead of reducing that pension pot through your tax-free cash option, so instead of going, I'm going to take some tax-free cash in exchange for my guaranteed income through my defined benefit scheme, they go, actually, that pot you built up of 25,000 of AVCs or whatever figure may be appropriate, we're going to allow you to take that all as tax-free cash or add it to the tax-free cash you could have also had through your defined benefit scheme. Now, you might be going, well, what's the benefit of that? Well, If your defined benefit scheme has really valuable income, so it might have inflation increasing income, spouse's pension built up, you may still want some tax-free cash, but you may not really want to reduce the level of guaranteed income because of the value there for kind of the reasons I explained a little bit earlier. And this basically can allow you to take your flexible pot as maybe all tax-free cash, or certainly a certain amount of tax-free cash. Now, there are limits. You can't just throw 500,000 into your AVCs and expect to get it all as tax-free cash. There are rules and so forth around how much you can take. But it's definitely worth looking into if you have a combination of both, because theoretically those AVCs might be able to all be tax-free cash one day. Now, the key distinction is that if you were to set up a SIP or a pension with a different provider, best case scenario, 25% of the pot you build up is going to be tax-free. So you can see the benefit is potentially more tax-free cash from your AVCs, but also more guaranteed income. Oh, the final one is, are returns guaranteed? Very rarely with AVCs, unless you build up additional pension, because you could then say, well, actually you're building up additional pension. Again, I'd have to kind of give you like 10 scheme examples to really do that bit justice. So you have to check the scheme rules. Thanks for your question. So I am eBadger, love the name, asks, is the commutation factor for the tax-free lump sum the best way to compare defined contribution and defined benefit schemes? No, is the answer, depending on how deep we're going on the question. So the commutation factor is the pension tax-free cash exchange factor. So basically, if it's 12 to 1, which is pretty low, but I think that's the one that most local government schemes align to. Basically, you're getting £12 of tax-free cash for every pound of pension you give up. Now, that is a good kind of comparison, purely just looking at the tax-free cash elements and how much pension you're giving up. But it's not really a very good example of how valuable the pension and defined benefit scheme is compared to if you just had a flexible pot. The best way to do that, if you were to just compare the defined benefit scheme from a flexible pot, is you would understand the basis of your defined benefit scheme, and you would do a quote based on your current age for an annuity. And you would write it in exactly the same way. So earlier on in this, I gave you that example of trying to look at annuity rates based on how the scheme is written, as in how the rules are written. That's what you would have to do to get a direct comparison. But it's not just, you have to, when you're looking at it, just think about the defined benefit scheme and the fact that your employer is taking all of the risk there as well. So you don't want to make an assumption and go, okay, at 60, my defined benefit scheme is going to be X. I'm 45. If I can buy an annuity today, which is going to match that, because the risk that you have is that your environment, when you actually go to buy said annuity, may be wildly different. If you had made that assumption in, for example, the 90s, where interest rates were higher, and then tried to encash that annuity or buy that annuity when you were in the depths of COVID, when interest rates were so low, you would have had a nasty shock, because you just can't buy that guaranteed income. So the commutation factor is a good way to check how generous the schemes are being from your tax-free lump sum, and whether you should be looking to take tax-free cash from your defined benefit scheme as opposed to protecting more of the guaranteed income. But it's not a good metric alone in isolation for the value of the scheme. I can't pronounce the name. Heliosilia. We'll go for that. Apologies. Just butchered your name. If there were 7 years of very high levels of inflation, wouldn't many defined benefit schemes paying out trivial pension given the caps on inflation protection? This is a good point. This is a good question. So the answer is technically yes, but I would really push back on sort of the trivial pension element and how realistic that is. So there are some schemes out there that are uncapped. So CPI uncapped, which is consumer price index, RPI uncapped, which is retail price index. Less common, those ones. However, many of them either sometimes operate just a flat 3%, or often more commonly, it will be inflation capped at a certain amount. And when you go into your look at your pension, you probably will have different tranches of benefits, I explained in the other video, which will have different levels of inflation protection. So the question is, if we saw a higher inflationary environment over many years, would this erode the value of the pension? Well, the answer to that is definitely yes, it would. But I would make the case that if you're for the vast majority of schemes, if they have a cap of 5%, while we are going to have times where you're going to have 10% inflation like we did a couple of years ago, because it's so damaging for when inflation gets above 5% in any economy. Ultimately, if we saw that year after year after year, you have to question what would the position would be for other assets as well. And I think as far as risk management, while I think it is something to be aware of, and it's a really good point in relation to that, I think it was quite unlikely that you would see inflation, which is going to be after 5%, 5%, 5% every year. You know, and inflation is one of those things where it can be so damaging, quite literally cause revolutions, that, you know, it's quite rare to have persistent inflation at those levels. What your point really does illustrate in a really good way is to double check the details of what levels of inflation protection you get from your defined benefit scheme, because there are some people who they've built up the pension before 1997 where they don't actually get any increases under statutory. So basically, this is where I can go into the weeds here a bit, but some people can have a big chunk of their defined benefit scheme which doesn't increase with inflation when they take the benefits, when they put it into payment. And sometimes the bits afterwards may only be a small amount capped up to inflation up to 5%. Sometimes if it's, say, after 2005, it can be capped up to 2.5%. So absolutely, if we saw quite a few years of 3.5, 4% inflation, which I think we probably are in a position where we're going to see much structurally higher inflation over the next decade than certainly we did the last decade, you are going to potentially see an erosion of value in those benefits. So that's notable. It does, however, I think it would be a stretch, though, to say that these benefits are going to be worthless, because ultimately, if you're 1% under inflation but you still have that valuable guarantee, you are still getting an inflation increase. Great question, though, and it allowed me to talk a bit about it, so thanks. Ian Armstrong, thanks very much for your question, Ian. It would be worth spending some more time explaining actuarial reductions and break-even ages. If I compare taking my reduced defined benefit scheme at 55 versus full value at 60, the break-even scenario for two scenarios is 72. Okay, so I actually had quite a few questions on that cumulative value, pension timing analysis. So just to recap what it does, when you're considering when to take your defined benefit scheme, certainly what I'm doing with my clients is that you look at all their assets and you go, you know, there's no point taking a defined benefits scheme early, getting hit for early retirement factors if there is an enormous amount of cash and it's not earning much in interest. You need to kind of have a look at the big picture here. But at some point, you'll typically be making a decision across all my assets and going, okay, when is the right time to draw this? And an element of this is subjective, because ultimately, for a defined benefit scheme, if you happen to defer the pension till much later retirement and then you pass away, it may be the case that you get a guaranteed period for 5 years and then it drops to a spouse's pension, which could just be 50%. So there is an element with a defined benefit scheme of how lucky do you feel. You know, you can insure yourself for a period to kind of protect against that. But how the break-even amounts work is basically you look at the pension, you put the age in, and then you basically make an assumption based on the tranches of benefits, because they can all have different levels of inflation increases, whether you take through tax-free cash or not. And basically then it will work out option 1 or option 2, and where does, using all your assumptions, which are just assumptions, where is the crossover? Now, because I had so many questions on this, I actually just built a calculator, and because I want to try and be more generous with my audience when I can, I will probably at some point put this behind an email list, but actually I've just put a link in the description. So you can have a go, let me know if you find it useful. Basically what the calculator will do, and I'll do a quick run through now, you can put in the age you take it. I have intentionally put all these different tranches in so that you can put up to, I think, like 5 different tranches, different inflation assumptions. Most people might just be 1 or 2, so you don't have to put all 5 in. And then you can also put a tax-free cash amount in if you want to, if you compare it. I have only put 2 options here. You could always just do another one. It allows you to print to PDF. So if you want to compare option 3, print option 1 or 2 and then do option 3. It's pretty easy. You won't get the nice graph though. But basically the cumulative value is it's just a very simple spreadsheet, and it's just looking at, okay, what age, based on all my assumptions, would the crossover occur? The only thing that I haven't done in the spreadsheet, and I went back and forth on doing this, was whether to give an option to increase the tax-free cash with inflation or just use it as you take it and it's a nominal value. I decided that was just kind of over engineering it. And while you could take tax-free cash and invest in stocks and shares, ISAs, I was like, this is just too much, I think. The one thing that I have included though, which I think is quite good, is I've got a tax rate reduction that you can apply as well. So one of the things I'll often work with clients is that if they take a pension at a certain age, it might be quite attractive, but it'll have a different tax outcome because they'll have more tax liability. You can actually then click a button, as you'll see, where if you want to, for example, apply 20% all the way till normal from state pension age, I should say, it'll just apply it from all those ages. So give it a go. Let me know what you think. If you like it, maybe consider following or subscribing to the channel. Thanks. Okay, so the next one, the new career average schemes are now linking access to state pension age. Okay, yeah, I think that's the case. Not the actual number, I believe. So I think that's the case for government schemes. So if the predicted income currently says 20,000 at retirement, but then that increases to say 74, oh God help us, hope it doesn't. It's still only 20,000, right? But now maybe 6 or 7 years later, that's a huge negative. Yeah, you're spot on there. 7 years at 3% say penalty for early access. What you're referring to there, just for the people who are listening, is that if they, let's say in that example, it did go to 74, and then you get 3% per year early access because you still want to retire at 67, you're in a position where ultimately you've had your significant pension reduction. So you're right, is the truth. It is a risk, like the state pension is a risk. What I would be saying on that is that if you have a scheme that has that rule, in the same way we've got to apply with the state pension, if you're looking decades out, the onus is on you to make sure you have a backup pot. There is not much we can do about it in relation to the fact that that might get increased. I think state pension age at 74 would be a significant change. It's not impossible. Again, I don't know your age, so if someone in their early 20s, could happen. But if it's going to happen, one would hope it's going to come alongside significant improvements to life expectancy. So there's two sides of the coin there. However, yeah, you're right. It is important to bear in mind that could be a significant downside. I don't lose sight of the fact that it is a very, very valuable pension though. I used to work with medical professionals, and it was shocking how many kind of the younger ones, because they'd been soured by their consultants in a lot of cases, because they'd been hit for annual allowance and lifetime allowance, which is a whole different episode, which was ridiculous for what it's worth. They were basically sometimes going into work and losing money. They kind of soured out the junior doctors, and they sometimes were opting out. Now that is generally speaking, is a terrible idea. And again, going back to myself or my colleagues or anyone, probably quite a few people watching this who don't have that option for a defined benefit scheme, the way I would say is that if you have access to these valuable benefits, and a lot of the heavy lifting is done by your employer, then you just need to put some of the onus onto your own wealth building if you can, and think, okay, if they were to do that, what would I need to do today to make sure that I have my options? Sorry, it's not a brighter conclusion, but I think it's important I'm honest with you. Adrian, thanks for your question about defined benefit and defined contribution. I think I've answered that quite a bit before, so it was basically on how to use the mix. John is the answer. Okay, ideas what to do with the lump sum, or the tax-free lump sum, which equates to 3 times annual pension. Take a bit more risk, buy an additional annuity elsewhere. Okay, John, so I'm going to give you such a politician's answer. It's hugely dependent on what you want to do, is the truth. If I'm advising clients on, and they're going to get a tax-free lump sum, especially if it's automated through the scheme, like a 3 times annual pension is, the first thing I'm kind of saying is there any, goals, dreams, and aspirations? Is there anything you want to do? This is an opportunity to spend some money. Now, of course, I get the luxury, because I work with clients and we do cash flow planning, that I've done all the professional work in the background to make sure that I know they've got enough, and I've stress tested it and all the rest of it. So if I'm telling them to spend more money, that's because it's core to my identity to make sure that people get the fruits of their labour, what they've spent decades working for, as far as enjoying their retirement. If you're in a position though that you don't need the money, then of course you can look at investment options. Put into a stocks and shares ISA. You can consider additional. There may be options through defined benefit scheme to buy additional income. Now that doesn't typically tend to be the case if you have a 3 times annual pension tax-free cash option. but it's worth checking the schemes. Midnight Archive again, you asked 2 questions, okay. We're often advised not to transfer a defined benefit pension because it's guaranteed income it can provide. Are any circumstances when transferring a defined benefit pension to a defined contribution might make sense? Yeah, absolutely. It's the rule from Financial Conduct Authority is these benefits are suitable as in defined benefit schemes, but there can be exceptions. Now, the exceptions typically are you might have someone in ill health. That's a really big one because the value they get through the guaranteed income for life might be significantly less. They may be able to, if they're, let's say they're at retirement and we're in a high interest rate environment, they may be able to get better benefits on the open market, especially if they do have some health issues. So when you buy a guaranteed income for life or annuity, it is subject to your health. They do underwriting, which is where the insurer basically goes, okay, we're going to give you this, but if you have some health issues, we'll give you a better rate with annuities. It's one of the rare times where having health issues works in your favor. Simply put, because you're less likely to live as long if you have significant health issues. So let's say you've got someone who does need a guaranteed level of income, but they are in really bad health, they're single, so they don't need the spouse's pension that's written with the defined benefit scheme. It may be worth them considering what an annuity is like if they were to underwrite it in their own name, and if that could provide a higher income. Another time it might be suitable is if you've got someone who doesn't actually need the income, so that they actually need a degree of flexibility. So let's say you've got someone who has an NHS pension, which is really big, their state pension. They also have a private defined benefit scheme, and they don't need that other one. And they're going, well, actually, I've got a lot of secure guaranteed income, but the nature of this income is it's backloaded. So ultimately, I'm going to have a higher and higher income the older I get because of state pension kicking in. Now, actually, for my situation, I have all my needs met, but I need a bit more flexibility in the early parts of retirement, and I don't have other ways of getting this. There are, I could go on to this for ages, but there are always individual circumstances. But as a general rule, they're suitable for most people, these schemes. So, seamless, right? Anyway, the reason why I did this video is because ultimately I had a load of questions around defined benefit schemes, and it was clear that there wasn't that much content out there about it. If there's any other topic that you want me to address that you maybe think is underrepresented, please do let me know in the comments. And if I get enough, then I'll do a separate video entirely on whatever that topic may be. Either way, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.